So this is the moderator, and for the presenters, just let me know when you'd like to change the slides.
Will do. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. And I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend today's webinar. And this webinar is the board's way of connecting with managing licensees and the premises staff at the veterinary facilities. And we use this to convey useful information for when a board inspector arrives to inspect your premises. So we're not there to disrupt what we know are your busy schedules, but rather we're there to just point out some areas that need attention, and the inspector is there to guide you in order to achieve compliance and to ensure that the minimum standards for the facilities or veterinary premises are met across the state. Uh, Following this webinar, you will receive a post-inspection survey and a CE certificate in the next 2 weeks. So the post-inspection survey is an evolution from the last couple of webinars, and so we do appreciate very much if you complete that post-webinar survey. And unfortunately, due to a recent order, the FDA halted all external communications. As such, they were unable to participate in today's webinar, but we do have our very own Dr. Jim Howard, who's our board consultant and board inspector, and also Dr. Christina Costa from the Board of Pharmacy. She's a supervising inspector there. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. Okay, why inspect? So take some time and put some answers into the chat as to why you feel the board conducts inspections. Okay, can we see some of the answers there, moderator?
I can. Would you like me to read some of them?
For sure.
Okay, so to ensure compliance with regulations, to make sure standards are met, follow up on complaints of suspicious activity, maintain standards.
Okay, those are all great answers. Can I get the next slide, please?
Of course.
So the purpose of the board inspection program is essentially to educate all the licensees. Protection of the public is the board's highest priority. So this is the inspection is primarily an educational tool, and our main outreach program to ensure that minimum standards are being met across California. So this ensures that consumers can expect that whether they visit a premises in Malibu in LA County or in Marysville in Yuba County, that the minimum standards are being maintained at both places and at all times. And today we're going to be taking a step-by-step look at the inspection process, but with a focus on misbranding, and we'll see how the inspector documents areas that don't meet those standards and how they communicate that information to the managing licensee or their designated staff, and how to provide corrections to the inspector. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a knowledge check here, true or false. The board can inspect records at any unregistered facility. And we'll give you a few moments here to answer that. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that. And yes, majority there answering this correctly, true. During an investigation, the board has the authority to inspect records as well as equipment and drugs at any location where veterinary services are being offered. Next slide, please. So this is all the language from the statute regarding the board's authority to inspect, but essentially the business and profession code provide the board with the authority to inspect any location where veterinary medicine is being practiced. The statute states that all records are required to be maintained by the veterinarians. All of those records are open to inspection at any time during an inspection or during an investigation. And this includes equipment and drugs on the premises. Those are also open to inspection by the board. And inspections can be random, unannounced, and can take place at any time. Having said that, though, if it's a lot of our routine inspections, we actually do a courtesy announcement ahead of time. We do contact the facility ahead of time to schedule a routine inspection. Next slide, please. Okay, the criteria for inspectors are that this is open to veterinarians and registered veterinary technicians with a minimum of at least 5 years of licensed practice within the last 6 years. And so that's what's required in order to qualify. And again, the goal is to just help educate the licensee and how they can bring their premises into compliance with the Practice Act. Their primary job is to communicate deficiencies, if any, and ultimately it is up to the managing licensee to determine how best to make the corrections in order to meet the minimum standards. And also when an inspector arrives at your premises, they should have a board issued identification that identifies them as a board representative. And I will say that we are continuously looking for additional inspectors, particularly in the Fresno County area, as well as the Bay Area. So if you are interested, if you meet the criteria and you aren't interested in being an inspector, please feel free to reach out. You can go to our website and there's information there. Next slide, please. Now the goals of the program, as we've been saying, is an educational tool. It's not meant to be punitive. We are looking at the health and safety of consumers and their pets, letting the managing licensees know of any new statutes, regulations, as those do tend to change as they pertain to the minimum standards, to ensure that the facilities are maintaining sanitary and sterile conditions at all times, and that the medical records are adequate and that they contain the required elements, that the drugs are handled and stored properly and secured properly, and that the premises maintains appropriate drug logs as required by law as well. Next slide, please. So all the regulations, statutes, and regulations that we practice under are contained within the Practice Act. Some are also under the Health and Safety Code, some are federal, some are pharmacy law. 4883 does contain information, the statute as to how you may be disciplined by the board. And we're going to focus today on misbranding. And so we're going to be going through a lot of codes and statutes and regulations. And also, if you ever want to take a look at the Practice Act, you can go to the website and take a look at the electronic version there. And the latest is 2024. We should have a 2025 one posted in probably the next couple months. Next slide, please. We've got another knowledge check here, true or false, that the managing licensee during an inspection must be present. So is that true or false? They must be there during an inspection. And we'll give you a few moments to answer that. Okay, so as most of you know, that is false. the managing licensee does, next slide, please, I'm sorry. The managing licensee does not need to be present for the inspection to take place. So taking on that role of managing licensee does come with many responsibilities, and they're spelled out there. They don't have to be the owner in order to be the managing licensee. And there are multiple statutes that they need to be in compliance with, like registering the premises, all the sanitation, the records, all the equipment, and all the drugs. Those all fall under the responsibility of the managing licensee. Next slide, please. Okay, again, some of the inspections are unannounced, and routine inspections are randomly selected. All types of premises are going to fall under the inspection authority. So that could be a mobile practice, house call, at-home euthanasia, vaccine clinics, anything like that. The minimum standards that compliance starts with the regulations 2030 and ongoing. The inspector will identify areas that do not meet the minimum standards and will provide a reasonable amount of time to correct the violations. And on the board's website, you'll find an inspections tab where additional information is provided. And we'll talk about that later on, but there are a number of resources under that inspection tab. There are samples of drug logs and biennial drug logs. And there's also a link to the medical records that spell out all the required elements in a medical record. Next slide, please. Okay, if you this is the QR code. If you want to do a screenshot of that, that will take you right to the inspections tab. There are also, if you're interested in being an inspector, the application is on that tab as well. There's also a self-evaluation checklist. There's FAQs on that. Some information about VACSPs, and as I mentioned, drug log samples. The managing licensee responsibilities are linked on there as well, and I would encourage veterinary staff to download that inspection, the self-evaluation checklist, and conduct a mock inspection of your facilities. We're currently undergoing some updates to that, but the information currently on there is still really good information that applies. Next slide, please. So when the inspector arrives at your premises, they should leave you with their business card. This is essentially what they'll be leaving with you, and their business card has QR codes too, as it says right there, inspection documents and links of that inspection tab, also the checklist, and then also the Breeze sign-in page is on there. Next slide, please. And this is the self-evaluation checklist. If you want to do a screenshot of this QR code, it'll take you right to the checklist. And as I said, if you download this and just do a mock inspection of your facility, that's a great tool to use. And then that way, when the inspector does arrive, you're pretty much ready to go. You know what the areas that they're going to be taking a look at. Okay, and with that, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Patty. Our subject matter today is what is misbranding. And for most of you cowboys, cowgirls, and veterinarians out there, the only thing you probably ever learned about branding was the application of the iron to the flesh. But we are not going to talk about branding of cattle or horses today, or how to rustle your neighbor's cattle or change the brand. The focus today is actually about misbranding as it applies to drug use. And with that, we are very fortunate to have a colleague of mine from the Board of Pharmacy, Dr. Acosta, join us, and she's going to help us navigate some of the code-centric parts of this talk that are actually very difficult to grasp. And I hope that we don't get too caught up in what the codes are, but instead try to focus on the big picture of what is misbranding and why veterinarians should not participate in it. So with that, if we could have next slide, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Acosta for a bit.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I will also try not to get too much into the code. So as always, here are the disclaimers that I have. The next slide, please. So we did talk about misbranding having a lot of related laws, codes, regulations, however you want to put them. So this is some of them. But we'll be going over just a few of these, and in hopes that you gain a better understanding of what it may be to call a drug misbranded. Next slide, please. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is clearing up some terminology. So I think that it's going to be interesting for us to understand what is said when we talk about extra label use versus the use of that and maybe what would be used in the human scenario when we talk about off-label. So normally you'll see the term extra label use when somebody's talking about Amduca. In general, that means that the product has been FDA approved for use in a patient population. Normally it's human or animal, so it'd be different patient populations, but then it's going to be used for the patient population that it was not necessarily approved for. This may include the ability for a pharmacy to use the FDA approved drug in compounding. Next slide, please. All right, so a lot of times we get adulteration of a drug confused with misbranding. So we wanted to make sure that you understand that there is a distinct difference between adulteration. This is going to be the FDA definition, so the federal definition of what adulterated is. We will be focusing mostly on just misbranding here. So next slide, please. For the purpose of today's discussion, we'll be addressing extra label use, or excuse me, we will not be addressing extra label use or compounded drugs. That's a whole subset of a population that would take a long time. Extra label use, again, has FDA approval for a labeled, it is labeled so that what the label actually shows, the actual sticker on the bottle, shows an indication or what it can be used for or what it's been proven to treat. Misbranded drugs, in general, lack one or both of these. Compounded drugs are not FDA approved regardless of where they are compounded or the source of raw materials. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Christina, or Dr. Costa. The purpose of this slide is just to point out that misbranding can be very serious and it can have some huge consequences. Without naming names, this is a veterinarian that in recent history received an 11-year prison sentence, was ordered to forfeit $10 million over about a 20-year history of misbranding. And it involved, this particular case involved the FBI, it involved the federal government, and they took a really, really hard approach to about 30 individuals, all of which pretty much got jail time. So we don't want this to ever become any of us, any of you out there. Believe it or not, the board would rather not see you in the office or see anything like this happen. And hopefully what we can provide you with today maybe can prevent some of this from happening. So at this point, if we have next slide, please.
Back to me. Thanks, Dr. Howard. So let's start with what is a drug. It's important that we have a brief understanding of what we're misbranding, right? So if you look at different terms, it could be a drug, a dangerous drug, a legend drug, or a prescription drug. So we're going to kind of break down a little bit what we mean when we say it's a drug. Next slide, please. So under California law, we look at the Business and Professions Code 4022. The most common thing that you see in California or the Business Profession Codes or even the CCNR, you'll see the term dangerous drugs. And what does that really mean? It really just means that it's one that holds the federal caution. So you'll see on the label, it says federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription, RX only, or some similar words such as that. That's probably the most common understanding in California law when they say a dangerous drug, and in this case, or a device. Next slide, please. And now we'll look at what a different concept is in actually Title 22, and you'll see a legend drug. And you'll see that the term is very similarly defined. Caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription, or something similar. So again, dangerous drug, dangerous device, legend drug, all of them are going to have a federal caution. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. Misbranding at a veterinary premises. Next slide, please. So what is a misbranded drug? So it's going to be a little bit of a complex subject, and we're just going to start with, we now understand what a drug, a dangerous drug, or a legend drug may mean. So then what does it mean to be misbranded? So we're going to start with a hopefully really brief discussion of some of the relevant laws. Next slide, please. As you can see, this is the California Health and Safety Code. And there is many, many, many codes that will outline what it means to define something as a misbranded drug. So the most common definition that we'll see is going to be the 111330. Any drug or device is misbranded if its labeling is false and misleading in any particular. You'll note that that's kind of a broad statement, in any particular. You'll also note further down in the section that it is unlawful for any person to manufacture, sell, deliver, hold, or offer for sale any drug or device that is misbranded. So not only does it define what misbranding is, it also defines that it is unlawful to manufacture, sell, deliver, hold, or offer for sale. Next slide, please. And you'll see here, this is the federal law, and the federal law is very similar to the state law, which is a benefit to us because we really only need to understand as practitioners one set of law. There isn't a contradiction there. So misbranding under federal law, again, if its labeling is false or misleading in any particular. Next slide. So then we're going to go through and talk about, oh, never mind, just kidding. So this is just the second part of the federal law that's going to tell you, just like our state law, that it's unlawful for you to introduce or deliver or introduce into interstate commerce any food, drug, device, tobacco, or cosmetic that is adulterated or misbranded. The federal law is a little broader than what our state law is. We only talk about drugs in our state law, but federal still has the same thing. You can't introduce or deliver or introduce any of those drugs. Next slide. So here is one of the state laws that we use kind of a lot over on the pharmacy side. It's the prohibited acts. So a person or an entity shall not do any of the following: purchase, sell, trade, or transfer dangerous drugs that the person knew or reasonably should have known were misbranded. So not only does state law prohibit you from misbranding it, they prohibit you from selling it. There's a second law code, and this particular law code comes with higher possibility of like cites and fines and different accountability on it. Next slide, please. And so this is the very similar, but in my opinion, much harder to read, section of federal law that will outline the prohibitions of what happens if you deal with a misbranded drug. And this is, again, the federal law. One more slide, please. Okay. So this particular section is important for you to understand. A lot of times we get questions on the pharmacy side, why? Why are you picking on me? So this one is a slide that's really important that you understand that each board is required to enforce the requirements for their respective licensees. So you'll see the pharmacy board, the dental board, all the way down, and we highlighted the veterinary medical board, the California State Board of Pharmacy, which is us, to ensure compliance with the section. And those boards are specifically charged with the enforcement of this chapter respect to their respective licensees. So that really comes down to the law requires us to hold accountable each of our own individual licensees. Next slide. So we have in California law a Business and Professions Code that requires us, I guess it says passively, to allow the Board of Pharmacy to take action for any drugs that do not conform with any standards of the United States Pharmacopoeia. And that would be if we find those to be misbranded or adulterated or even not labeled at all. The United States Pharmacopoeia, or the National Formulary, has many, many, many sections and chapters that relate to everything from drug packaging to drug labeling to drug storage to transport. So we have the authority to actually stop those from being in the patient population. And now we get to go back to Dr. Howard. Next slide, please.
Business and Professions Codes 4883 generally speaks to unprofessional conduct in the Veterinary Practice Act of California. 4883 is a section that I think every veterinarian should read. It's been humorously referred to, but I don't think it's always very funny. That's how you lose your license in subsections A through S. And this particular subsection G, subsection 3 of G, is the linchpin that would cause a veterinarian's license to be disciplined. And that is if you violate a federal statute, rule, regulation, or any of the statutes, rules, or regulations of this state, meaning California, regulating dangerous drugs or controlled substances, that you might be subject to discipline. So this is the linchpin code that pulls all of these other codes and regulations that Dr. Costas has gone through. This is what pulls it back into our Practice Act. Next slide, please.
Back to me. All right. So one of the things that I have needed to become familiar with is what a new animal drug is. And since the federal government, the FDA, is actually the one that approves drugs, one of the things that we use is what is a new animal drug. So I don't want to read all of this, but remember, the FDA approves the labeling, the actual physical sticker on a bottle. They also approve the indication. So we talked about that at the beginning. So this section will talk to you about how something, if it is not FDA approved, would then be considered misbranded for the sense of this, and sometimes even adulterated. So it's important to understand that new animal drug, if it's not properly approved, may actually be considered an adulterated and or sometimes a misbranded substance. Next slide. And I get a knowledge check. Is it permissible to dispense an expired drug if it is no longer on the market and the client is informed and agrees to it? But first, we're going to go back to Dr. Howard while you've input your code, and he's going to give us a real-life scenario.
Should we vote first, or are we going to move to the scenario? I think we could go ahead and vote.
Okay, we can vote. Works for me.
Yeah.
We have 225 people, and we only got 89 votes. Come on, guys. Come on.
Well, I think pretty much everybody got it got it right, which is that's false. So now, if we can have the next slide, moderator, we'll move on to a real life scenario. This is real. Actually happened. 2024. John Doe, relief veterinarian in a practice. Very good medical record, actually, and I have to commend the veterinarian for that. But he kind of created a problem for himself. He wanted to dispense tramadol for a coughing dog. The hospital did not have any controlled narcotic drugs that were in date. So tramadol was 2 months expired. He discussed it with the owner, explained that it was still bioactive. He was not aware of any toxic metabolites to worry about. If the owner wanted to wait till tomorrow, then the other DVM perhaps could write a prescription for the controlled drugs tomorrow. This relief veterinarian did not have their own DEA registration, so they could not prescribe to the outside. The owner decided that they would take a few doses tonight and then pick up a prescription tomorrow for hydrocodone. And the veterinarian did not expect any issues. Well, that worked until the client went home and thought about it and filed a complaint with the veterinary medical board. Then, of course, as the complaint goes, we had to become involved and investigate that complaint. So the client was informed, the client agreed, the veterinarian dispensed the expired tramadol. However, it did put him in violation for dispensing an expired drug. Next slide, please.
So we know the answer. The answer would be false. So our question was, is it permissible to dispense an expired drug? And of course, the answer is false. And the Business and Professions Code we just talked about, prohibited acts, says a person in entity shall not do any of the following: purchase, sell, trade, or transfer a dangerous drug or device that's beyond the, after the beyond use date on the label. So of course that's not permissible. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Howard, and he's going to wow us with his amazing pictures.
Dr. Acosta did a great job, by the way, going through some really painful codes, and made it a lot less painful for us to listen to. And it's just painful stuff. So now I get to do the fun part, which is we're going to show some pictures, and we all know that we learn better by looking at pictures. So we're going to bring you some examples of the real world and start with some very minor misbranding violations, and we'll move into more major stuff as we go. So if we could have the next slide, please. This is a bottle of, as I remember, I think it was a wormer of some type. And if you look at the writing on the bottle, you're going to notice this combination 4, maybe 5 bottles. So what the veterinarian had done here is they had combined 4 or 5 bottles of material, let's say it's a wormer, into one bottle, and then crossed out the expiration date on the label and somehow came up with a new expiration date, which they thought would be better. Went from 2007 to 2008. So I think we remember from basic chemistry class in high school or college that we don't typically return things into stock bottles and mix stock. And this would be a prime example of a form of misbranding. And keep in mind that there are many, many different ways to misbrand, and we're going to show you some of these. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the most common ones that we see occurring in a veterinary premise. Again, a very minor thing. It's very convenient to put the Pyrantel out of a pint bottle into a dropper bottle like this. They get kind of disgusting, and that's not really the subject of the misbranding. But the problem is that we're not carrying the complete label directions. I'm sorry, not directions. The complete FDA-approved label from the Pyrantel bottle to these dropper bottles. In other words, do we have the lot number? Do we have the expiration date? Do we have the manufacturer? How do we know if a recall came down the line that this product would be that product? And I will guarantee you, as these bottles get empty, the practices just add to them. And so eventually you'll get a mix of different manufacturers, Pyrantel as well. So a very common occurrence. Next slide, please. Same thing here, secondary containers, very convenient, but it is misbranding. Next slide, please. And here the veterinarian has decided to mix ivermectin with his Pyrantel, so he's created a new drug, also misbranding. Next slide, please. How do we solve this? Well, here's how one of our licensees solved it. We at ABC Veterinary Hospital will not misbrand Pyrantel by putting it in Yorker bottles or secondary containers without proper labeling. What they did is they chose to leave it in the pint bottle that they bought it in, and they put a stopper in the top of the bottle so they could draw directly into a syringe. A very easy, neat solution, and it keeps all the label as it should be, and this is not misbranding anymore. Next slide, please. This is a common one that we'll see on inspections. We'll just have some random loose tablets or capsules in a bottle or in a bag on a shelf. And we'll ask, what is this? And they'll say, well, that, it's just some pills, and it's obviously ampicillin or tetracycline or whatever. And it's pretty hard to be obvious that it's anything to the inspector when they come through. Next slide, please. Again, a very common form of misbranding, diluted acepromazine. This one happened to be from a bottle that had expired in 2011, and that bottle was being used at the admission of the licensee to make the diluted acepromazine that's in the vet wrap that had a 2019 expiration date on it. Or it was made and maybe it expired in 2019. It's made in 2019. It doesn't make any difference. Expired drugs are being used to make the diluted acepromazine, and this is, again, not carrying the label information to the diluted form that's all in the vet wrap. Next slide, please. We don't have to do that. Here's the solution to dilution. Buy littler syringes. It's pretty easy. Make a dose chart or make a dilution chart. Dilute at the time of administration or admix. And one of the arguments that we'll often hear is that, well, that's too expensive. I can't afford to buy these little tiny 3/10 ml syringes. So next slide, please. Oh. Well, we're out of order, but I'm going to come back to that. This is our box of butte. This is a form of misbranding. This entire box of maybe 50 or 75 syringes, each pulled up 10 cc's of butazolidine, no labels, no manufacturer, no lot number, nothing on the syringes whatsoever. So this is a little more extreme example of misbranding. Obviously convenient for the practitioner, but it is a violation of law. Next slide, please. Here's where the veterinarian took what might have been properly labeled hydromorphone, but they affixed their own label to it. And therefore, they obscured the original label from being read, and they created a misbranded drug by applying this label. This was obviously not being dispensed. It was being used in the office. Next slide, please. Here's some azithromycin. Again, a secondary label container and without any of the FDA approved labeling on it. Next slide, please. This is pretty commonly seen. Here's Thyrotabs, 20 each in these bottles. They've been counted out. They put the expiration date on them. And the reason for doing this was stated as it's convenient to have the pills already counted out into 20s. And when the techs don't have anything else to do, we have them count out pills and they're ready to go. Well, again, we're not carrying over the label material from the stock bottle to the secondary containers. We'll see this a lot with, for instance, dermatology clinics. They'll have, bottles of 100 tablets of an antibiotic, all counted out, ready to go, because they hand them out, literally one appointment after another. But it is misbranding. Next slide, please. Same thing with Rimadyl in this instance. This is not a dispensing label. This is not what the client should see. This is Rimidyl's been counted out and placed into a bottle. It is misbranded. Next slide, please. This was an interesting one. Came from an inspection. This is Kitty Whiskey. I'm not still sure today what this drug is, and the managing licensee was unable to tell me what one of his veterinarians put it in it either. But they sent it home with the client like this. And we have a very prescriptive regulation that tells what needs to be on the label that's going to be dispensed. And I'm not going to read it all to you there, but I think everybody knows what it should be. And we don't send drugs home with clients like this. Keep in mind also as veterinarians that we are charged with dispensing our drugs in childproof containers, just like human pharmacies are. So the practice of placing the drugs into Ziploc bags, paper envelopes, things that obviously are not childproof, it's an illegal act and should be highly discouraged, of course. Next slide, please. Dr.
Look, I got
Acosta.
a fun one. I did one with a picture. Oh, okay. So RTS, or return to stock. What does it mean? When should or could it be done? And how it should be done if you plan to do it. So return to stock should only happen when its drug is in its original manufacturer's integrity. It needs to be stored correctly. It should never left the control of the provider or the office. If you can't tell what the manufacturer's lot was, you should not restock it. You should not dispense it again. Can you tell what the manufacturer's expiration date was? Is it within that expiration date? If you don't know, it should not be returned to stock to be redispensed. It may be considered to be misbranded if you don't know any of that information. It's also very important to say you should never take something that is a return to stock and dump it back in to a manufacturer's bottle. Capsules, liquid should never just be dumped back into the manufacturer's bottle. Several reasons. One, you might not actually put the right drug back into the right bottle. It happens all the time. Two, the drug that was taken out of the bottle, it may have a different expiration date or stability information once it's taken out of the manufacturer's bottle. The other thing is if you plan to leave it, like we see in these pictures where it says return to stock and you have patient information, it should be completely removed before you redispense. You shouldn't just label over one patient's information with another one. So it's really important when we look at return to stock items.
Christine, can I add one thing to that?
Absolutely.
Somebody that takes a bottle like this and then just slaps another printed prescription label on top of the RTS label is a great way to trigger a board complaint, because the client is going to notice that there's another label underneath there. They're going to pick away at it and pick it off. And there might not have been anything illegal about having done that, but it sure is going to frost the client. So I would discourage you from doing that. Please spend the extra few cents and put it in a new bottle. Thank you.
Well, next slide, and we're back to you.
Here we are. I'll do the knowledge check. True or false? Drug distributors and pharmacies do not sell misbranded drugs. The veterinarian can be assured drugs purchased from drug distributors and pharmacies are legal to use. True or false? We'll give it a few seconds here. A little more mix-up on this one, and so it's a good knowledge check question because there's obviously a little disagreement in the answer. So let's have the next slide, please. So I think everybody knows who Covetrus is. Covetrus in 2024 got fined $23 million for selling misbranded drugs, delivering into interstate commerce. Year of probation and $23 million in criminal fines and forfeitures. So again, pretty serious stuff. The question is, knowingly or unknowingly? Did they know they were doing this, or did they just make a mistake? Distributors should not be selling misbranded drugs, and it still happens. Next slide, please.
So to add to what Dr. Howard said, a distributor, we call them wholesales on our side, they should be licensed with us. We regulate that, and they absolutely positively should not be selling you something that's misbranded or adulterated. We are happy if you need to report that, to send it our way. And I will remind you that the misbranding laws that we talked about in state and federal, they just said it is misbranded if it's false and, false or misleading. It didn't say that you knew. The only thing that says that you knew or reasonably should have known was that prohibited act. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, it does put the burden on the either prescriber, dispenser, depending on where you're looking. So in this slide, we're looking at a product that Dr. Howard and I have worked with together. This is a particular product that is, it appears to be acceptable for use, but then once you look at who manufactured them, you will see that they're misbranded because the manufacturer made them, but they're not an FDA-approved drug in any capacity. So we did talk about that new animal drug section. This would be one of those ones that would be considered to be misbranded because they are not manufactured in a facility that is licensed, and they were also not FDA-approved products. So it's almost a buyer beware. I would highly encourage you to purchase from people that are licensed with the board. They are within our jurisdiction, and if we are having these problems, we are happy to work with each other. That's how I met Dr. Howard, to ensure that the products that you receive are appropriate. Next slide, please.
So we're going to use into the veterinary use of misbranded drugs and how veterinarians actually use these misbranded drugs in their practices and what happens. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a very innocuous drug that's created a huge amount of confusion: aspirin. So everybody would think that aspirin would be an over-the-counter drug. And there are aspirin products on the market that are over-the-counter drugs. Over-the-counter drugs are regulated by the FDA by monograph. In other words, there's a recipe book of ingredients and uses and manufacturing techniques in these monographs, and that's how FDA regulates the over-the-counter drugs, which are generally considered safe for use without a prescription. You're going to notice that there's no national drug code on these products, no NADA, which means new animal drug application, or an ANADA, which means the abbreviated new animal drug application numbers on the labels. The abbreviated new animal drug application is generally reserved for the production of generic drugs in which the entire approval process can be truncated or shortened up somewhat. If a product shows a medical indication on it, in other words, it says this is here to treat fever, this is here to treat pain, this is here to treat whatever medical condition it says on the label, then it's a drug. It may or may not be an approved drug, but it is a drug. So this whole thing of trying to figure out, as Dr. Acosta said, buyer beware, figuring out what drugs are approved by the FDA, which ones are misbranded drugs, which ones are counterfeit drugs, is very difficult. And I'm going to be the first one to tell you that we understand that. And it's not always that somebody's trying to do something bad. Sometimes people just couldn't figure it out at all. And to further confuse things, there are companies that will even place a counterfeit NDC, NADA, or a NADA number on the label in order to sell their drugs. Next slide, please. Here's a recent FDA warning letter to dairy practitioners. You food animal practitioners out there probably have seen this one. Basically, due to avian flu in the dairy herds, there was quite a lot of unapproved aspirin that was getting put into the dairy cattle. And of course, this is a food animal species, which raised the eyebrows of FDA quite a bit, and warning that there were no approved aspirin products for large animals. I know they're on the market. I know you can pick up the telephone and order a tractor trailer load to your clinic tomorrow, but they are misbranded. And use extreme caution if you choose to do that, because you're exposing yourself to problems by doing that. Next slide, please. Dr. Costa previously spoke about this drug. It is not approved by the FDA. It's been on the market since 1990 in the United States. It lacks legal marketing status, does not possess a NADA or a NADA number. The label does have medical indications on it, and the manufacturer, even in their own paperwork, has a disclaimer stating that the drug has not been found by FDA to be safe and effective. The labeling has not been approved by the FDA. So this really creates a confusing state of affairs for the veterinarian. You are hoping for a lot of regulatory discretion here when you use products like this, and why FDA has allowed these products to remain on the market. It's time and materials, and how much enforcement do they have? What's the risk to the public? That's often what they will tell you, is that the patient population risk is not high. So you are depending on a lot of regulatory discretion here when you get off into these areas. Next slide, please. And of course, they're not the only manufacturer. There's 3 other manufacturers of exactly the same product, none of which are approved. To further demonstrate the confusion, all 3 of these products carry NDC codes. So the fact that a product has an NDC code on it is not a guarantee that it's an approved product. And Christina, Dr. Costa, if you want to elaborate on that, how drugs get NDC codes without being approved.
Well, my understanding of that is an NDC is just a tracking number that the FDA gives them. It does not relate to how they've been approved, whether it be for patient population, indications, doesn't matter. You'll see that in our outsourcing facilities. They will have NDCs. It doesn't mean that they're approved. Unfortunately, that is a very common misunderstanding. It just means that the FDA hasn't tracked.
And it really just adds to the confusion out there for the veterinarians. So
absolutely.
Sometimes you just got to do your homework and depend on your associations, whatever type of practice you're in. Get some help from the AVMA, the CVMA, the Association of sheep practitioners, whatever your practice affiliation is a good place for information as well. Next slide, please. So animal drugs that are not approved or index listed. Index listed is generally reserved for minor species, aquarium fish. Index listing might apply to oyster spat, which is a larval form of an oyster. Something bizarre and unusual can often get index listed with FDA without going through the full approval process. Very few of those drugs generally will not apply to anything we do in normal practice. But if they lack the required approval, again, to introduce or deliver those adulterated animal drugs into interstate commerce is permitted under federal law. And we have similar state laws and health and safety codes that mirror the federal laws here as well. Next slide, please. Again, we talk about misbranded drugs, same thing, just stated in a different way. Next slide, please. And again, the penalties are severe quite often. If you knowingly sell, purchase, or trade a drug or drug sample, you can be imprisoned for as much as 10 years or have a fine of $250,000 or both. And these are some pretty huge fines. And this isn't something you would think would be applied to the guy that made a mistake, because I thought this was a real drug. This is made for the big players and the heavy hitters, of course. Next slide, please. And back to Dr. Costa.
Manufacture and sale of misbranded drugs. Next slide. So we briefly talked about the Thyro-L that Dr. Howard and I had done before. It's important to note that you can also have a drug that is misbranded because it was manufactured, prepared, promulgated, compounded, keeping in mind compounded, or processed in establishment not duly registered. So we're going to go over a few things where they were manufactured or compounded in a location in which they were not registered to do the function that they were. Next slide, and back to Dr. Howard.
So the next few slides are going to be examples of things that we'll call them manufactured. The people that manufacture these drugs would like for you to think that they're compounded. Doesn't really make a lot of difference. These manufacturers or compounders are not licensed to ship into the state of California. And without a sterile pharmacy non-resident license to ship their products into California, they can't do it. Can you buy it? Yeah, you can buy it. You can jump on the internet this afternoon and buy all this that you want and have it shipped to you. Is it legal? The answer to that would be no, it is not. So again, just because you can buy it, be careful. When I went to veterinary school a long time ago, we were taught as veterinarians we can use any drug however we want to use it as long as we can legally obtain it. But what they didn't explain to us is, what does legally obtain mean? And the purpose of this talk is to try to help you sort through some of the weeds on that. We thought it meant, well, we can't use, LSD and cocaine, but it's a lot bigger picture than that. Next slide, please. Here's a similar product made by a non-resident manufacturer pharmacy. They're trying to say it's a homeopathic treatment. It's an IV injectable. Again, they claim on the label themselves that it's not FDA evaluated. So this would be an example of a misbranded drug, also not licensed to sell into the state of California. Next slide, please. This is really getting into manufacturing, and under AMDUCA, of course, as veterinarians, we can order and use compounded drugs. And compounded drugs require a prescription. In this case, there's no prescription. There was box after box after box of ketoprofen in exactly the same concentration, different size bottle, but exactly the same concentration as commercially available ketoprofen. And so essentially what's going on here is this facility was copying commercially available drugs, which hurts the drug companies. It doesn't help them at all. And because it's not an approved form of ketoprofen, the safeguards that would be there in the manufacturing process, the testing process, all the things that go into an approved drug, is, as well as the base chemical that it was made out of. We don't know if the chemical in this case had a good analysis. We don't know if it came from China, if it came from India. We don't know anything about the drug that was used to make this, the chemical that was used to make it, other than the fact I can tell you it wasn't made from ketoprofen that was FDA approved and just put in a bigger bottle. Because the veterinarians, when I asked, why do you use this? Because it's so much cheaper, Doc, right? Next slide, please.
I was going to add to that.
Go ahead, Dr.
Sorry.
Acosta. Yep.
So this is one of the instances where Dr. Howard and I work together a lot. When a location, whether it be an outsourcing facility, which is those big locations, or a pharmacy decides to, I'm going to call it manufacturing. So it's important to remember that compounding is a subset of manufacturing. And the only way a pharmacy or an outsourcer can compound a product is under allowances that it's not manufacturing. But when they don't comply with those, such as Dr. Howard just talked about, a prescription, it then becomes manufacturing. And again, we talked about anything that is manufactured in a facility that's not registered to do so makes those products misbranded. So it's really important to understand that while they may tell you it's compounding and it's okay, if they're not complying with all those rules and regulations, you may have just purchased a misbranded product. And again, state law says you have to know, but federal and a different state law says it doesn't matter, you just can't touch it. Also, keep in mind, there is no law that allows them to compound or manufacture something just because it's a cost difference. You cannot make something just because it costs less. As far as the commercially available, there is no law that allows them to make something that is commercially available. That is a very complex process. Additionally, the location that this particular ketoprofen came from held no license with the California board to ship any sterile product. This is where Dr. Howard, staff and mine, we really communicate really well, because if you are purchasing from locations that are licensed in the state of California, if it's a pharmacy, they should have 2 licenses with us. 1 is a non-resident pharmacy, and 2, a non-resident sterile compounding pharmacy. And the assurances you get from that is that one of our trained pharmacists goes on site at least once a year to make sure those products are being compounded safely. And I highly encourage you to check that out on our website and purchase from people that are licensed with us, so we can take some of the burden off you to not purchase misbranded products. Thank you, Dr. Howard.
Thank you. Good information. Next slide, please. Here's a product that's not commercially available in the United States, has never been FDA approved for use in any species in the United States, but you can buy it if you want it. And it's available through many, many places. They seem to specialize just in this one drug, actually. Just they're making their living just selling this one drug. The source of the drug that they sell is unknown to us at this time, but this has become a very common product that's showing up recently. Next slide, please. This is a case of the fish myosins. And if you're not familiar with fish myosins, you also might call them the bird myosins. And there's companies that will sell fish amoxicillin or fish ivermectin or fish tetracycline. And it happens to come in human dose forms. The fish mox comes in a 250 milligram capsule, and I'm not sure how the fish takes the 250 milligram capsule, but this is actually going on in California. These are boxes of the drugs that you can see here. They're very familiar drugs to all of us. They were illegally sourced. They came from different countries besides the United States. Most of them were expired. Most did not have any sort of a certificate of analysis. We would call these bulk chemicals. And if we could have the next slide. Just, you know, box after box after box of this stuff. So this case became involved with the California Department of Public Health. They have a drugs division which regulates the manufacture of drugs. And we accompanied them. The original tip-off on this came from the Food Animal Antibiotic Resistance Database, or FARAD, and people were inquiring about using enrofloxacin in their backyard chickens as it was being advertised by this company on the internet. And for those of you in the know with food animals, enrofloxacin is a banned antibiotic in food animals, and certainly a chicken and its egg is a food animal. So they were very interested in shutting this down, and we went along. And here's next slide, please. Here's what happened. Every drug that was in this facility was embargoed by the California Department of Public Health. We had multiple, there's one in the foreground if you look close, multiple bins of drugs were all sealed up here. The manufacturing was abhorrent. The place was dirty. There was flies in there. Every drug label on every single drug, it didn't matter if it was ivermectin, amoxicillin, oxybenzole, whatever it was, every single drug had exactly the same expiration date on it. So obviously a pretty shady outfit. All these drugs got embargoed, and CDPH required the owners of this facility to come up with a disposal plan that was acceptable to public health for disposing of all of these pharmaceutics. And the trash can was not an option. So I'm sure it was very expensive to get rid of all of these drugs. Next slide, please. Just more of what went on. Next slide. We couldn't finish this talk without a talk about DMSO. And it's interesting that California has a health and safety code that concerns DMSO. And that if you sell DMSO in this state, you have to put a statement on it that it's unlawful to represent that it's safe to use for medicinal purposes. There is no medically approved DMSO at this point in time. There used to be an ointment for horses and dogs. This is tech grade. I don't care what they put on the label, it's still tech grade. It's not approved by the FDA. The facility that makes it is not approved by the FDA. The labeling is not approved by the FDA. This is a misbranded drug. Next slide, please. And now we get to do another knowledge check. Drugs ordered over the internet. Go ahead.
Yep.
Dr. Costa.
Oh, you could read if you want. I don't care.
Oh,
All right.
it has me on there too. You go ahead. Go ahead.
But I'm first, and then you. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Drugs ordered over the internet from Canada by a veterinarian in California can be legal use to treat animal patients as long as the veterinarian has established a VCPR with the owner and patient. True or false? I'm looking for, above 90 here, people. Come on. It's only half of you. 77. Oh, 81. Come on. Come on. Oh, we made it. Okay. All righty. So next slide. Again, false. I hope I didn't have to say that. Okay, everybody take a breath. This is a picture that was taken by the Veterinary Medical Board inspection. It shows an attic drug room storage in Southern California in August without any climate controls. So we want to just take a moment and talk about drug storage and how important it can be. The storage of a drug is extremely important to its stability and its ability to retain its actions. I'm really good at giving cooking examples in all of my compounding, so we're going to think of a drug as milk. If milk is your drug, we're going to go with it's good for 15 days in a refrigerator and 45 days if frozen. We know that we can do that to milk. Normally, it's not an issue. However, we really have no idea what happens if you take that milk and you store it in a room at room temperature. How long is it good for? What will happen to it? Well, what if you take it and you put it outside in 80-degree heat and in the sun? That changes the chemical composition. The same is true for drugs. If a drug is either stored at too low of a temperature, frozen, or too high of a temperature, it can denature a protein, which breaks the chemical bonds inside, and it can cause unwanted chemical reactions. So again, back to my cooking analogies, we would never refrigerate an oil. It changes their chemical structure, causing them to go rancid. So it's extremely important that any drugs, whether it be oral or injectable, are stored according to the manufacturer's specification. Again, that will be on the label, what that FDA-approved labeling tells you to do. Any drug stored inappropriately can be considered adulterated, and that will likely alter the manufacturer's expiration date. And then when you go ahead and dispense or use that, you have now dispensed or used a misbranded drug. It's really important to think about that. You would never store a vaccine in room temperature. You would never leave it out in an area that it wouldn't be protected. A vaccine, like any other drug, can be denatured really quickly and lose its potency. Next slide, please. This is an example of an oral agent, and you'll see that I put there the USP control temperatures. So a lot of times it's important to understand that even though it's room temperature, it's controlled room temperature. So there is a finite amount of time. So you'll note if it's hot outside, it's 92 degrees, this particular product would have to be put into a controlled room environment. If you could read on the FDA-approved labeling, this particular product is requiring between 68 and 77. It requires to be maintained at room temperature. Again, anything exposed to environmental conditions that fall outside the manufacturer's recommendations can be considered to be misbranded or adulterated. When prepping for this, Dr. Howard and I were kind of joking because I live in a rural area in San Diego, and I always see the big veterinary trucks driving around, and they have all the compartments that are locked in the back. And I was not aware they actually have a refrigerated section in there, because I always thought that the drugs would just be kind of sliding around in those compartments. So it's important when you're in an area that's not controlled, that your drugs are stored at that proper controlled temperature so you get the potency, or else those drugs, when you dispense or use them, could be adulterated or misbranded. So storing your drugs appropriately is extremely important. Next slide.
And now we're going to move into foreign drugs. I think this one's going to be pretty obvious, but some of these slides are kind of fun to look at. So if we could have the next slide. Here's a drug called Arcel. It is a foreign drug. It was manufactured by Parfarm in Juarez, Mexico. It's an arsenical product, not approved by the FDA. You're not going to find any NADA numbers on it, or ANADAs or NDC codes on it. And it's very honestly sold as a drug in Mexico, but it gets into California. And obviously we have a lot of proximity to our neighbors to the south, and that makes this easy to occur in California. Next slide, please. This one's kind of a tip off just from the label as well. super vitamina. The Spanish label should be a tip off. Again, Tornell Labs is a Mexican manufacturer, not approved by the FDA for use in the United States. This would also apply to some drugs that you might think are going to be okay by who made it. So next slide, please. Here's our friend Zoetis, which is a worldwide manufacturer. And this is an injectable iron product. However, it's not approved for use in the United States. So keep in mind that just because it's approved in another country doesn't necessarily mean we can use it here. There's been some very rare instances where FDA has allowed importation of drugs from Canada for human use, but not for animal use. Next slide, please. And here's the kind of trouble you can get in from using some of these foreign drugs. This is a ranitidine injectable product. And in April 2020, FDA requested immediate withdrawal of all ranitidine products due to carcinogens that can occur when they're stored at high temperatures. So this was a very common product in the United States for a long time in ulcer products, but the FDA pulled it off the shelves. But you know, that didn't occur in other countries. So again, there's reasons not to use these drugs. Next slide, please. And this is something that we see as well pretty commonly. Whether we're on vacation, we pick these things up, how they get into the clinics. They get there somehow. And here's your Depomedrol, but again, not with a FDA-approved label for use in the United States. Next slide, please. And here's a Catron. To make a double whammy on this one, Catron is a mixture of phosphorus, strychnine, and arsenic. It's not approved by the FDA. It's interestingly indicated by the manufacturer to treat anemia, postpartum paresis, stress, metabolic imbalance, infertility, and sexual deficiency. So it's pretty much a do-all drug, and it was expired at the time of the inspection when we found it as well. Next slide, please. And then there's some obvious tip-offs on labels sometimes that perhaps these are foreign drugs. When you see species that we would not commonly encounter in the United States on the labels, that's a pretty good tip-off. And also the manufacturer being in China is a pretty good tip-off as well. Next slide, please. And I think we'll send it back to Christine to talk about the Board of Pharmacy.
Yep.
Slide.
So, yep, no problem. This is our contact information. If you go on our website, which is pharmacy.ca.gov, and you have questions, we have something that's called Ask the Inspector, which is one of our inspectors, which again is a licensed pharmacist that will help you get some of your information. And I would highly encourage when you go to our website, you look at the very top row and you hit verify a license. If you're looking for a licensed wholesaler, there's a way that you can select that information and make sure that they are licensed with us. There's also a way that you can look to see if the pharmacy or outsourcing facility you are thinking of purchasing is licensed with us. If you have questions, that's our phone number. And thank you for inviting me.
Next slide, please. Patty, do you want to do this one?
Yes. So this is the contact information for the board. There's our website. If you have any questions that maybe it looks like we're going to have quite a bit of time for questions, but if you have a question regarding this webinar, please send it to our email is right there, and you can on the subject line you can put Misbranding webinar. There's our phone number as well, and on the board's website you can sign up for any email updates, and we will send updates on board meetings, any kind of updates on laws and regs. We also send out information if there's pending regulations and upcoming webinars, updates to statutes, anything like that. If so, if you want to sign up for to be on the email list, that's a good source of information. And we also have our social media pages, so you can find us on X and on Facebook. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for some questions, and we'll see how many questions we are able to get to. We've got some time left, so if you have any questions, you can, moderator, if you can open up the.
So I did open up the chat. I can also, if you prefer, just open up the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let me, all right. Let's see, did anyone, okay. All right, so I have opened up the Q&A. So if anyone would like to type a question there, they may. So in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you might see a question mark in a box. If you click on that, you'll see the Q&A, and you can type a question and send it.
Oh, actually, Dr. Howard, I did have a question for you in the Covetrus case that we saw on the slide. Do you know how the drugs were misbranded in that case?
In that particular case, they were large animal drugs that were being sold without prescriptions to producers in non-conforming, I believe, fashion. In other words, first of all, without a prescription. Second of all, without proper labeling, and they became therefore misbranded. I don't have the case details other than that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious if we knew if we had any additional information on that. And then also, I know in our inspections, we will see the use of kitty magic in the veterinary premises. I know that's come up. And I'm not sure what that is, but I'm pretty sure that's probably misbranded.
Correct. Kitty magic is a mixture usually of ketamine with dexdomitor, usually some butorphanol. And if it's mixed at the time of administration, it's fine. If it's mixed in advance of administration in bulk, it is misbranded. And it also creates a lot of problems with logging of the drugs for DEA purposes. Usually have 2 narcotic drugs in there, and typically the 2 other drugs, the dexdomitor and the butorphanol, are mixed into the ketamine bottle. And as you may or may not be aware, a 10 ml bottle of ketamine might contain 11 mils of ketamine. It might contain 10.5 mils of ketamine. There's usually overfill in these bottles. And so when they try to break that out and actually account for controlled drugs use and logging, it becomes very problematic. So I tried to have the slide in there about what those little syringes cost, and it got dropped out of the talk somehow. But those little syringes for the micro dilutions, they're basically $14 a box. So they're very competitive, actually. They're insulin supplies. And so there's really not a reason you can't use those things. They're not cost prohibitive whatsoever. So should we just take questions from the top there? I'm thinking that first question probably should go to Dr. Acosta.
Okay, you want me to read the question and then you can answer? Okay, how about, this is from Jen, a question from Jen. How about medications not available in the US, as an example, Flovent steroid inhaler only available in Canada?
So that would be up to the FDA. Again, FDA is the only one that can approve a drug for use. That would be, in my personal opinion, an importation of a non-FDA approved drug. So just like we just talked about all those foreign drugs that Dr. Howard just talked about, it would be considered a foreign drug unless the FDA has waived some ability to get that drug in. Flovent, that I'm aware of, is a human drug, so there may have been if there's a shortage, but I don't believe that would be doable.
Okay, thank you.
I'll pick up the one, what labeling is required for saline syringes, reconstituted unison or ampicillin, et cetera. The saline syringes for flush, obviously you cannot transfer everything to that syringe. The inspectors are not going to have much trouble with a saline flush syringe as long as there's not a box of 30 of them sitting in a drawer somewhere. If you're going to want to keep syringes of saline or heparinized saline around like that, we would highly encourage you to purchase the commercially available unit dose refilled syringes that actually come in a, I think they can come in a 3 or a 10 mil sizes, and use those instead. The false economy of mixing up a bag of sterile saline in a 1,000 mil bag and then having to toss the bag once that bag has been punctured. It's a false economy trying to save money by doing that. And there are commercially available products that completely get around that problem.
Okay. Next question's from Dr. Grant Miller, CVMA. If you affix a dispensation label over all or part of the original manufacturer's label, is the drug considered misbranded?
Dr. Costa, I'll take that one.
Please.
If you're dispensing a drug, whether or not you're dispensing it in a secondary container or you're dispensing the entire manufacturer's stock supply somehow, especially if it's large animal orientated. The fact that this is the dispensation and you have affixed the label, the dispensing label that contains the instructions, it contains the doctor's name, the clinic's name, the drug, the expiration date, all the required things that need to be, the SIG, all the things that need to be on the dispensing label. At that point in time, it's a finished form for dispensing. And you would not have misbranded the drug by placing that label, say, on top of the label of the ivermectin paste or whatever it might be that you're dispensing, because it's being dispensed, and it is a legitimate dispensation with a proper label on it. Keep in mind, however, that if you're dispensing a stock bottle of something, let's say it's a big horse and it needs to have a lot of antibiotics of some type, and so you're going to dispense a 500 count bottle of whatever the drug is. If it's in a regular screw top bottle, that's not going to be childproof, and so that creates a little bit of a problem there. So within the realm of normal dispensing practices, that would not be misbranding of that drug. Do you agree with that, Christine?
Yep. I just wasn't familiar with all of your labeling requirements for dispensing.
Yeah, we went through the label requirements earlier in the talk. They are in the Practice Act and the CC&Rs.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question's from Katrina. I was taught that you could write "use as directed" on a label, yet I see it all the time. Somewhat went on human prescription.
So I guess I'll start. You may have to fill in. So on regular dispensing from a pharmacy, use as directed is allowed, but out of a pharmacy, there's a requirement for a new prescription to have a consultation. So yes, it is allowed, but there's an expectation that a pharmacist has explained, use as directed, or at least try to go over it with the patient. Dr. Howard, do you have input on that one?
Yes, we would allow it, but somewhere along the line, the medical record is going to have to indicate what the directed use was. So there needs to be some backup to that. So that's just not a, first of all, it's not a really good idea. But second of all, the medical record is going to have to back up what use as directed meant and how that was communicated to the client.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Georgina. Is it okay to rebottle alcohol, chlorhexidine, or hydrogen peroxide to smaller bottles for use in the clinic as long as they are labeled?
I'll take that one. These are not drugs. These are not drugs that are intended to be used. These are antiseptics, disinfectants. There are secondary labeling requirements that are required by, I believe it's OSHA, that these be identified as to what they are and what their risk factors might be. There are definitely kits that can help you properly label your secondary containers for those type of chemicals.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Kevin. Please discuss MTBs. How long are they good for once the stopper has been pierced?
I will take this one. So a multi-dose vial under standard of practice is 28 days. That is under the United States Pharmacopoeia. The only way it can change to be longer than 28 days is if the FDA has approved that labeling. So first puncture, 28 days, and it needs to be labeled as such once it is punctured.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Sumitra. Creating the miracle mouthwash mix would be considered not acceptable under these guidelines?
So that falls into the umbrella of compounding in a veterinary premise. The Veterinary Medical Board has regulations in the Practice Act that cover compounding in a veterinary premise, when it's acceptable, how it has to be done, the documentation that's required, who can do it, how we come up with expiration dates. There's a lot of stuff to unpack there. And certainly you can do it, but it has to be done within the guidelines for compounding in a veterinary premise.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Lou Bet. Can we use expired drugs for clinic use only?
I'll take that one as well. If you're using the expired drugs on patients, the answer to that is absolutely not. No. Can you take expired drugs home and use them on your own animal? Sure. It's your animal. You can do anything you want to do with your own animal. We don't have any control over that at all. But you cannot use expired drugs for anything in the clinic that would involve a patient that belongs to the public.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Anne. Is it permitted to reconstitute Tilazol with acepromazine instead of sterile water for in-hospital injection use only, not for dispensing?
I think I'll have to take that one too, because I don't think Dr. Costa is going to be familiar with the drugs. So taking the powdered Tilazol, using acepromazine to reconstitute it would be a extra label use of the tilazol and of the acepromazine. Again, it would be compounding in a veterinary premise, and it should be relegated to the use of an individual patient vis-a-vis an order or prescription. Again, when you go to the extra label use of these drugs, the liability shifts to you as the veterinarian. Don't call up the manufacturer of tilazol and say, I had a bad reaction to this drug that I mixed with acepromazine. They don't want to hear it. And you're kind of out there, you're out there on your own with your own insurance carrier. And I'm not saying that there's anything illegal about doing it, but you do need to document what it is you're doing and do it within the realm of compounding within a veterinary premise.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Heather. We had a client ask for us to cut their tablets prior to dispensing. We told them we don't cut the pills. Is cutting tablets considered misbranding?
I'll take this one. So in a regular retail pharmacy, we cut tablets all the time because you want to make sure that an elderly patient doesn't cut it wrong. You want to make sure it's actually halved. We have the skills and the facilities to be able to do that. So where you have to be careful not to misbrand it is if you cut a 2 milligram tablet into 1 milligram halves, it's how you label it. So you can still label it as if you're dispensing a 2 milligram tablet, but then you would say in the directions for use, however you want to verbalize it, please take 1/2 of 2 milligram tabs. You know what I mean? Product already cut in half. Something that it makes it very clear that you are dispensing one thing and you're expecting them to do something else. So again, misbranding is false and misleading. Don't let your label be false or misleading. That's all we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Elizabeth. What about administering an expired drug for euthanasia?
I'll take that one. That's a pretty common question, actually, and it's not unusual that we'll find expired euthanasia solutions, expired propofol, other, sedatives used as part of the euthanasia process. Again, it's against the law to administer or use an expired drug. And I think we should just leave it at that without getting into the particulars of, potency, how long it's been expired, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just against the law and it's bad practice. So I think that should close that one up.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Jen. How about Chinese herbs utilized in veterinary practice? For example, if getting supplements from a pharmacy in Florida, which is the only place that it's made, or for instance, a life-saving herb, for example, Union Bio, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. There is no other medications to replace that.
I'll start, Dr. Acosta, and you can maybe jump in. We certainly see Eastern medicine being practiced in the veterinary field, and see lots of herbs, lots of supplements. We see Union Bio, which is to help blood clotting, commonly used in dentistry in dogs and cats. I think the veterinary board has pretty good discretion in this area. It's really hard for those of us that are trained Western to appreciate the Eastern approach sometimes. And a little bit of this jumps across maybe into the naturopathic medicine that Dr. Acosta might be more familiar with. I think if they're looked at as supplements and not drugs, then we probably are not going to get too involved with it, as those are not a regulated entity unless there's a problem. FDA's approach towards supplements has generally been, you guys self-regulate yourselves out there, as long as everything's cool and nothing happens and nobody's harmed, we don't get involved. But once there's problems, then they would step in if the supplement is found to be more aligned with being a drug. Dr. Costa, you want to comment on that?
So the only thing I would add is like you just said, Dr. Howard, supplements are not drugs. We talked about legend drugs, prescription drugs, dangerous drugs. Supplements don't tend to be that. I mean, there are a few things that cross over between drugs at a higher dose and not, but if you're getting it from a pharmacy in Florida, that kind of sparks my interest. Make sure that if it's being compounded by the pharmacy, that's within the scope of something that would be considered to be a drug. A pharmacy can only compound dangerous drugs, devices, legend drugs, things like that. That's a federal requirement. And there should be no indication, meaning there should be no take this and it will treat, cure, prevent, or diagnose anything. A supplement can't do that. Under federal law, a supplement is to supplement the diet, which is completely different than a Chinese herb in my understanding of that. So we don't do much when it comes to over-the-counter products. That's not really our scope, but we will investigate if a pharmacy is compounding or making claims that it's doing one of those things that falls into the category of drug, legend drug, prescription drug, those types of things.
Thank you both. The next question from Tiffany. For written prescriptions, we are getting a lot of issues with CVS wanting a DEA number for non-controlled prescriptions and refusing to fill the medication without DEA or MPI, which DVMs do not have. What is the recommendation for this?
On that beautiful website, pharmacy.ca.gov, we take complaints. I am not aware of any requirement as long as you have a license to prescribe and you're within that scope that they can require that. It may be a software issue. I'm not really sure, but you may absolutely file a complaint. We do have a regulation that requires the pharmacy not to impede a patient, human or otherwise, to get a drug. So file a complaint with us. Like I said, pharmacy.ca.gov, and you can just file the complaint there. We will investigate.
That's my understanding as well, Dr. Acosta, is that it's a software issue, and that's how they're identifying the prescriber is by their DEA number. And it's pharmacists, some of them know how to circumvent that, some of them don't know how, and veterinarians cannot get a NPI number or national provider identification number. It's only for physicians. So you can have the discussion with your pharmacist. That's as Dr. Costa said, is impeding your prescription, and maybe you can talk them around that. But it certainly is not a legal requirement. They have your DEA number for non-controlled prescriptions.
And moderator, would you mind putting up the Board of Pharmacy contact slide again?
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, thank you. Now, next comment, this is a comment from Kelly. This was great. I'm sure many of us would love a similar talk regarding compounding laws and OTC drug use. So Kelly, that's a great suggestion. And if you want to include that in your post-webinar survey, that would be great, but we'll make a note of that. Next question from Dr. Grant Miller. Basically, if a drug has NADA or ANADA number on it, we are likely going to be in good shape for using it, barring any other laws that restrict use and limit use.
I can start on that one, Dr. Acosta. But I think I have to answer that as a negative example, in that if a if a drug does not possess a NADA or an ANADA or an NDC code on it, it likely is misbranded. However, the fact that a NADA or an ANADA or an NDC number appears on the label does not guarantee that the drug has been approved by the FDA. As we had mentioned earlier, there's counterfeit labels, and the drugs often have been issued in NDC, perhaps through an application process that was never fulfilled. It's not a guarantee at all. Dr. Costa?
I would love to say that if that number is there, you are good to go. But unfortunately, the entire DCA has jobs because there are people that will put things on a label that are not true. So yes, it's a good start. If it's not there, we definitely have a problem. But if it's not from somebody you've purchased from before, or you've kind of looked at the reputability of the person that you're purchasing it from, I would do a little bit more diligence. You can actually look up some of those numbers on the FDA website. There is a way to, in the Purple Book, to see, which is an FDA resource on all the approved drugs. Are you Green Book? No, are you Green Book, Dr. Howard, or Purple Book for the FDA approved ones?
We just go to the website and look it up.
Okay, yeah, so there's the Orange Book for human drugs that are approved, and there's, I think the Purple Book actually is biologicals, and then the Green Book. Yeah. So there is a way to look up all the FDA approved drugs on the FDA's website so that you're not reliant on just somebody's labeling to ensure, and it will include the manufacturer of them as well. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Raquel: is placing Metacam in individual syringes from a larger source of Metacam considered misbranding?
I understand this question, so I'll take that one. So what the question is the practice has drawn up, for instance, 3 days worth of Metacam in individual syringes, and then they're going to dispense those and for the owner to administer. The proper way that should be done is to take those 3 individual syringes that have been filled with Metacam and place those into a child-proof dispensing vial of some type, and then affix a dispensing label to that vial. At that point in time, no misbranding has occurred because these are at this point in time dispensed drugs. And with the proper label on it, which would identify and have directions for use, administer 1 syringe, orally each day, something like that.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Joan: how do we get the CE certificate? Everyone will be receiving a post-webinar survey, and following that, you'll be receiving your CE certificate. So that will be happening in the next week or 2. Next question from Lindsay: what about drying up drugs for use same day? How are the syringes to be properly labeled?
That's a clinical thing. I'll take that one too. It's pretty common practice to draw up a sedative, anesthetic drugs, have those pre-prepared for a case. They might be somehow attached or affixed to some paperwork, an anesthesia sheet, something like that. That's fine. Usually most clinics are going to affix a sticker to the syringe that they might have written on. This is Alfaxin, this is propofol, sedative, pre-meds. Maybe it might have Bobo the dog's name on it, something like that. And that certainly the inspectors are knowledgeable and are going to allow for that.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Jamie: who regulates the feed stores that are allowed to sell vaccines and misbranded drugs?
That's a whole nother talk, right, Dr. Howard? So
pretty much.
an actual feed store is not regulated by the Board of Pharmacy, but if they are going to sell drugs, we do have a permit called a Veterinary Food Animal Drug Retailer License. So I don't remember how many years ago, was it 4 or 5? We actually started issuing and looking at these. If you're having a problem, again, go to our website, let us know what you're seeing. It may or may not be us, but Dr. Howard and I know how to communicate really well, and so we will figure out who has the jurisdiction over what's going on in what is likely a completely unlicensed location.
There's some input into that arena as well from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and they have an incursion into that arena as well. And from time to time, we do get questions about that. It's non-jurisdictional to the Veterinary Medical Board as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Jennifer. I know the answer is probably no, but is there any differences in rules for shelter animals or situations?
No. I mean, everything is the same. You can't use expired drugs. Don't do things with the drugs you shouldn't be doing. Don't buy your drugs from foreign countries to save money. Animal shelters, by the legal opinion of the board, in most cases, are practicing veterinary medicine and fall under the Veterinary Medicine Practice Act. And I say in most cases, it gets gray in some areas when we deal with rescues and who does the animal actually belong to. But generally speaking, if it's a revolving door, the animals come in, the animals are going to be adopted and go back out to the public, then there's a specific act that was passed by the California Assembly called the Hayden Bill, and in which they stated that the animals were involuntary repositories of the shelters, and therefore were not property of the shelter per se, and that makes it the practice of veterinary medicine. So all the things generally apply to animal shelters: premise permit, licenses, tasks that RVTs, assistants can perform, except they're a little bit expanded in the shelter situation for the RVTs. Couple of other things that assistants can do there if they've had the proper training, such as euthanasia. But generally, it's the Practice Act applies, and all the rules and regulations about misbranding would as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Sam. Asian medications such as Yunan Bio, not FDA approved, can they be kept in the hospital for in-hospital use? Since clients may not have access to a source, can they be resold by the DVM?
Okay, I think we kind of went over some of this already. Correct, they're not approved by the FDA. If we're looking at those as supplements, yeah, but they could be resold. Again, it's a weird discretionary thing with some of the Eastern medicine stuff. Dr. Acosta, you want to comment on that at all? Probably not.
Well, it's hard for me to say what would be okay in a hospital, so I'll put it back to a human hospital. And if it's not FDA approved, it's not considered a drug, and we wouldn't necessarily have jurisdiction over it. It's very similar to when, like, we had marijuana coming in with all those cards and stuff. It's a gray area, and you have to go back and forth on what would be the best benefit of the patient versus not allowing them to have it. So to me, there's a lot of enforcement discretion with this type of conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Coral. Synoptic is a commercially available canine ear drop that contains DMSO. Is it misbranded?
Let me take that one. It's Synodic is the product, and you know, I'm a little off guard on that one, just from the fact I guess I'd have to look at go back and look at the drug. It's been a few years since I've used it. I think I was aware that it had DMSO in it. If it's commercially made and it's been approved by the FDA and is made in a a facility that's regulated by the FDA, then I'm thinking probably it's okay. It's a topical. It's a topically applied product, but I'd have to go back and revisit the labeling on the drug.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Mark regarding OTC drugs made in accordance with monographs. I believe that these are only for human use. Are there monograph drugs available for animal use too?
I'll take that one. I believe that there are. I don't think the USP only does for human use, but that is a really great question. If you want to give me like 5 minutes, I'm going to log in and look right now. If you want to take another one.
Okay. Yes, next question from Amy. I'm involved in vet forensics and with warrants, we see foreign drugs all the time. Who do I notify? What would my next steps be when I come across them? These cases are not veterinarians, but private citizens. Okay, I think if we could put up the Board of Pharmacy slide again, Amy, you can probably notify the board if you've got any concerns with that.
Yes, that will work.
Okay, moving on to, go ahead.
Before we close, I had some other things to add to some of my other questions because I'm the queen of multitasking. So we actually have an article that I put into the Q&A so people can access it. It talks about the MPI and the DEA for vets. We apparently are very aware of the issue already. Somebody reached out to me on that. And then the Green Book is the book that I was referencing that's on the FDA website that gives them the ability to go ahead and look up FDA approved drugs. So those two things before you make us run away.
Okay, I think I'm gonna answer the one about the vet forensics question. Is that where we're at, Patty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I see foreign drugs all the time too. I live in California. So it's pretty common on our inspections to see these. If it's a veterinarian, we obviously have enforcement ability. Now, when you have private citizens, now it starts to kind of, we have to decide, is it their own dogs that they're treating with these foreign drugs? If it's their own dog that they're treating with the foreign drug, they could be violating importation laws themselves. If they're practicing illegally on other people's animals, definitely they're violating the Practice Act at that point. The board would have jurisdiction in that situation. However, if they're treating their own animals with illegally imported drugs, that would be an importation issue that would not be jurisdictional to the Veterinary Medical Board.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll just take one more. That's a question from Brian in regards to controlled drugs that need to be kept frozen, for example, Tilazol. How does one go about both locking this up and keeping it frozen when not in use?
I'll take it. This is pretty common. So there's only a few drugs that require refrigeration that are controlled drugs. Tilazol is a good example of one. And in past, matter of fact, we put on a webinar in the past on controlled drug, what to expect when being inspected, with emphasis on controlled drugs. And we showed some examples there of different ways to secure controlled drugs that required refrigeration. And basically they're small lock boxes contained within refrigerators, refrigerators with locks. There's I think we showed 3 or 4 different examples of different ways to secure those drugs, but they have to be secured just like any other controlled drug has to be secured. And security doesn't stop with just the box. It also extends out to who has access to the key, who has access to the keypad numbers, the combination, etc. That's a big part of security as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think we'll end there. It's 1 o'clock. So Dr. Howard, Dr. Acosta, thank you both so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us and our attendees. We really appreciate it. If we weren't able to get to your question, please send your question to the board. Our email address is right there, and on the subject line, if you could enter Misbranding webinar, and we will get to your questions. Thank you all so much. We'll have another webinar coming up in the future, and it will likely be focusing on cures is the next topic for our next webinar. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having
Dr.
me.
Costa.
And
Thank you,
thank you,
Patty.
Solid. Yes, thank you, Solid, for moderating.
Okay.